You won't believe what this one thing that all of the key figures and patriarchs in the Jewish faith and the Hebrew Bible have in common. Well, actually, you may believe it, and they probably have a lot more than just one thing in common, but there's one thing that I found this week that I think is pretty cool that we're going to spend some time talking about today. Well, hey folks, Steve Hopkins here, coming to you not live, but pre-recorded from the prayer room at Kendricks Creek, because it is prayer week here at Kendricks Creek, which is a time when we divide up the week into 24-hour time slots. 1-hour time slots, 24 of them in a day, if you're familiar with time. And we just come and try to seek the Lord together, where we want to intentionally prioritize this in our schedule as a church, in our life as a church, where we seek God's presence, His purpose, His will for us as individuals, our families, and our lives. Where we intercede for our neighbors, where we lay our petitions before the Lord. But it's just a time for us to intentionally set aside a week from all the busyness and all the activity and say, we are going to seek the Lord together. So if you'd like to participate, whether you're here local in the Tri-Cities or somewhere else, I encourage you to check that out. You can find us, you can find that link in the info in the post below for the sign up for that. For prayer week at Kendricks Creek. So I invite you to check that out if you'd like. There's a ton of different resources for prayer there if that's something you'd be interested in too. But the one thing that I want to share with you this week is I was really in prayer and thinking about, Lord, what would you have me say this week? And kind of asking Jesus, what would you say to our church and to our community this week? I came across this refrain throughout the Hebrew Bible. We find it in Genesis 8, Genesis 12, 13. We find it in the story of Moses and the Exodus. We find it in Judges. We find it in the life of Joshua and in the time of the first Kings, and then even to the life of the prophet Elijah. And it starts like this. And actually, to paraphrase this, Genesis 12, when God calls Abram from his homeland and says, go to the land that I'll show you, which would eventually be Canaan, aka the promised land. He says, I will give you descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashores. And Abraham's kind of like, well, I don't know, kind of old. But he goes and he's obedient and he's faithful and he follows where the Lord leads. Well, one of the things we're told very early on is that when Abram came to a particular place between Bethel and Ai, these two villages, we're told that what Abram did is he built an altar there, and then he called on the name of the Lord. And that just phrasing stuck out at me this week. And then I did a little search in this program, this Bible software program that I have on my computer, and I realized that this is perhaps the one thing that all of the great founders of the Jewish faith had in common. All these key figures and heroes in the Hebrew scriptures have in common is that they built an altar and they called on the name of the Lord. And what's interesting is that in some ways it was unique to them. There were not many instances outside of these particular figures that I'm going to talk about very briefly. And it was very unique to them. They built an altar and they called on the name of the Lord. We're told that Noah does this in Genesis 8, that he built an altar. We're told that Abram does this in Genesis 12 a couple times, Genesis 13, and then again in Genesis 22, when God calls him in some ways a test, but the call to lay the gift that God gave him, the child of the promise, Isaac, to lay him upon the altar. Abraham builds an altar there, and he calls on the Lord to provide for the sacrifice. God delivers Isaac from the very brink of death, and provides the lamb for the sacrifice. It's a practice that Isaac then picks up later in his life. He builds an altar and calls on the name of the Lord. Jacob, his son, picks this up, builds an altar, and calls on the name of the Lord. And then we don't hear much about it until we get to Exodus 17, when the people of Israel, who had been led by Moses, delivered by God out of the promised land, they had their first battle against the Amalekites. They're victorious. And then Moses, to celebrate, what's he do? He builds an altar. We're told that when Joshua enters the promised land on Mount Ebal, what's he do? He builds an altar. Later in the book of Judges, we hear that Gideon, when faced with the challenge before him and the people, what's he do? He builds an altar. Continuing on in the story, Samuel, the last of the judges and the first of the great prophets, when we're told that he frequently went back to his home of Ramah, and there he built an altar. Saul, the prototypical king, the first king of Israel, he built an altar and called on the name of the Lord. And then David, the archetypal king of Israel, he built an altar and called on the name of the Lord. And then finally, the prophet Elijah on Mount Carmel. What does he do? he builds an altar. Now, you say, great, what's that have to do with what you're talking about? I'm probably not going to go actually build an altar. Well, you probably are not going to build a literal physical altar. But part of what Prayer Week is about is this exact same idea. It's about building an altar. Because what is an altar? Well, an altar, especially in the ancient world and the Hebrew scriptures, it's the place of offering a sacrifice. It's usually not the place where the sacrifice is committed. It's the place of offering the sacrifice. And then what is usually associated with that, especially in the text that we just kind of briefly alluded to, is the idea of calling on the name of the Lord. They built an altar and they called on the name of the Lord. They summoned, they beckoned the very essence, the presence of the Lord into their midst. They built an altar, the place of offering the sacrifice, and they seek and they shout and they cry out to the Lord in prayer. Now, here's where this becomes really important for us today. Abraham Joshua Heschel was a Jewish rabbi in the mid-20th century, very influential writer, thinker. He taught at the Jewish Theological Seminary of America. I recently read a little book of his. It's called The Sabbath. Beautiful book if you want to delve into that practice. We're going to talk more about Sabbath, hopefully, in future weeks. But I was just reading for my own life and journey of following Jesus. And he's got this idea in there that the Jewish faith is a faith that's not necessarily dependent upon space, but is a faith that sanctifies time. And what he calls the Sabbath, which is the seventh day that God blesses and calls holy, he calls the Sabbath a palace in time. And his general argument is that the invitation for human beings is to sanctify the time. Paul takes this idea, this is redeeming the time, making the most of the time. Well, so here's what I want us to think about. One of the challenges that all of us face in life is that we're just so stinking busy. And I think particularly one of the challenges when it comes to prayer is that we're so busy, and the temptation can be, well, I'm too busy to pray. I'm too busy to take an hour out of my schedule to go to a prayer room. Of course, the point is not to log some time in a prayer room. The point is to encounter the living God. But you cannot do it if you don't have some space in your schedule. Henry Nouwen said that it's essential for disciples of Jesus to have silence in their life. So here's the invitation for us, I think, is that when we look back at the Hebrew scriptures, we see these great figures. They built an altar and they called on the name of the Lord. So the invitation for you this week, build an altar and call on the name of the Lord. But of course, it's not going to be a physical altar. It is the place of offering your sacrifice. But here's just my hunch. It's going to be in time. It's going to not be a physical, material space, but it is going to be the immaterial world of time. To build an altar in time, to set aside the time, to devote to seeking and calling on the name of the Lord. All the figures did it. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, Joshua, Gideon, Samuel, Saul, David, Elijah. They built an altar and they called on the name of the Lord. Make some time this week. Schedule it out. You're not going to do this on accident. If you wait till there's some white space in your schedule, it's going to get filled with other stuff. Set aside some time. Build an altar. Building an altar, it requires time, it requires sacrifice, it requires space, and you cannot do anything else while you're doing it. You can't multitask that. So this week, take the time, build an altar, and call on the name of the Lord. And just a hunch, right? I found it to be true in my life. I hope that you found it to be true in yours. That when you do that, when you set aside that time of pilgrimage, whether it's physically going somewhere or just kind of spiritually setting aside the time to be with the Lord, He will show up and meet you. So take some time this week. I encourage you, take an hour somewhere. Build that altar to the Lord this week. If you're local, I'd love for you to get connected and join us in the prayer room. It'd be a time when I think if you do it, no promises, no guarantees of what's going to happen, but I do believe you'll encounter God here in some way. It may not be super crazy or magical or mystical. It may just be very ordinary and mundane, but you will meet the Lord when you seek Him. And you will find Him when you seek Him with all your heart. It's a promise that He gives us. So praying for you guys this week, especially during prayer week. Reach out. Let us know how God's working in your life. Love to hear from you. Y'all take care. Share this video if you found it helpful. Comment on it if you got anything to share. Love to hear from you. Subscribe to our channel if you haven't done so. Y'all take care. Praying for you. God bless and make a great day.